Now, when we talk about the overload that people are subjected to, it's fair to say that the average person who's averagely involved in social media is probably getting interrupted once every 10 minutes, something like that. And we have to ask what this process is doing. When something interrupts you with an alert sound, it's gaining your immediate attention and focusing your left brain process, the ability to compare, contrast, and analyze, on something that's immediately changed.
That was Chris Lewis, author of Too Fast to Think, a best-selling book on reclaiming creativity in a hyper-connected work culture. This is episode 1 in a podcast series based on the book. Today's podcast explores obstacles to the creative process, where we get our best ideas and how information overload is changing us.
One of the questions that we all need to ask is really embodied in the Latin phrase quo vadis. Where are we going? Where are we going with our potential? And more importantly, where are we going to bring out other people's potential? Because the surest way of bringing out one's own potential is to concentrate on the potential of others. That's really what leadership comes down to. Thinking more about other people's potential than about your own. They say that when the clock strikes midnight, everybody gets a chance to reinvent themselves and wipe the slate clean. One of the problems that comes with the process of education is that education itself is a constriction. It's a constriction because it forces the thinking in one direction. And that direction can be best characterized by the phrase drill down. An expert might call this Western reductionism, where we take a subject, we break it into various components, and then we analyze those components and analyze the components of those components. And we arrive at an understanding of what something is. There is, of course, an equal and opposite direction to that, which is the process of synthetic logic, where one looks at a problem and relates it to other systems which encompass it or have a bearing on it. How does this work in reality, you might say? This theory, how could it be applied? Well, let's take, for instance, the ordinary car. If we want to understand how a car operates, we could break it down into driving systems, we could break it down into wheels, we could break it down into seat, engine, bodywork, etc. We would pretty rapidly come to the conclusion that the car as a motor vehicle was a utility and a benefit to mankind because it allowed you to move from place to place effectively and efficiently and safely. If one applies the alternative synthetic logic to this, one might look at the car and treat it as a singularity and introduce other systems to it. So one might introduce fresh air at the front and get dirty air out of the back. One might introduce human beings to one door and get strawberry jam and very badly damaged people out of the other side. If we looked at the system and how it responded to other systems' input, we might conclude through that process something which is completely opposite to what Western reductionist logic gave us, i.e., the car, far from being a utility and a benefit to mankind, is in fact a destructor of the planet and a destroyer of human beings as well. Two processes of logic, two completely different solutions. The same can be applied in the creative process, that quite frequently the received method of wisdom in coming up with fresh ideas is to bring people together at work and to concentrate on the problem and actively brainstorm. This is a process that's been used for many years, and it comes up typically with one form of creativity. If, however, we don't narrow creativity just down to simple creative people, and we start looking at how professionals and other problem solvers work more broadly, then we see there's another process at play. In Too Fast to Think, we asked several people from different backgrounds, 40 people who are military leaders or business leaders, artists, musicians, a variety of different people, and asked them a simple question. Where are you and what are you doing when you get hit by your best ideas? Now, this is not just about simple ideas. This is actually about epiphanies, game-changing, paradigm-shifting ideas. And the response from those people was really quite striking. Firstly, they reported that this process hardly ever happens in the workplace. Secondly, it hardly ever happens when they're with other people. And thirdly, it hardly ever happens when they're trying to do it. So somebody could be walking the dog, they could be in the gym, they could be falling asleep, they would be hit with an epiphany. And this is very interesting. Where do these ideas come from? What is the creative provenance? Because this is pointing to an avenue of our potential which remains unexplored and hidden from us by the very educational process that we have been inculcated with from the get-go. If you're a 25-year-old, the majority of your life has been spent in a Western reductionist system teaching you to ask questions and answer questions. Yet in many instances, it's not the reductive that brings about the epiphany. It's the synthetic. It's the ability to connect things up. And our brains are remarkable instruments insofar as they contain an innate ability to look across and join up the dots, yes, even when you're not aware that it's happening. Now, when we talk about the overload that people are subjected to, if, for instance, people are checking their email 20 times a day, 30 times a day, even more, perhaps they're being interrupted by social media notifications as well, it's fair to say that the average person who's averagely involved in social media is probably getting interrupted once every 10 minutes, something like that. And we have to ask what this process is doing. When something interrupts you with an alert sound, it's gaining your immediate attention and focusing your left brain process, the ability to compare, contrast, and analyze, on something that's immediately changed. And it's drawing your notice to something that's changed. It's waking up the sleeping dragon of Western reductionism. Now, one of the antidotes to that process is to not interrupt the brain and allow the brain to free fall in its own way for 45 minutes or more, and then it starts to switch off the left brain, critical faculties, to recognize that actually these are not needed at the moment, and it can move into a different mode. And this different mode happens when we're in the shower, when we're listening to music, when we're out walking, when we're doing anything specifically which may involve a rhythm or a process which the left brain has recognized and done many times before and is therefore not needed. We can't switch the left brain off, but what we can do is preoccupy it with something that it finds it doesn't really need to be conscious to do. That's when the right brain process kicks in. The right brain process is particularly interesting because it doesn't really have a narrative. The great Ian McGilchrist, who was a writer on the left and right brain process, pointed out that these two processes aren't actually resident in a physical left-hand hemisphere or a physical right-hand hemisphere. The processes themselves can be dotted all over the brain, but they've become known as a left brain or a right brain process because they conform to logical Western reductionism versus a more conceptual type of thinking, perhaps things which are classified as faith, belief, love, spiritual belonging, etc. Now, the left brain narrative is very convincing. The left brain narrative is the home of KPIs, key performance indicators. It's the home of logic and truth and measurement. But we know that all relationships that we have, particularly those in business, are not just a sum total of the logic of Western reductionism. After all, if you were to sit down with your partner once a quarter and discuss how many times each of you had performed the household chores and how that was going to compare to a set of KPIs, the relationship probably wouldn't last that long. Relationships need to be based upon things which are, by their very nature, intangible, because they deal with the spirit and the faith and the belief and the trust of someone. And we abandon these things at our peril, at the peril of not only our well-being and our sustainability, but of our creative ability.
Chris Lewis is founder and CEO of one of the largest independent marketing and communications agencies in the world. He is a journalist and author, including of the best-selling book, Too Fast to Think.